A year ago, I started training kickboxing and then Muay Thai, and during this year, I've had many crazy trainings and some epic sparrings. Yet this martial arts journey began a little bit earlier, in 2019, when for the first time in my life, I did 6 months of MMA that eventually led me to a full-on MMA cage fight. After the fight, I believed that I had the basics of striking down, but that was only until I met Sergey Masloboyev, a world champion kickboxer with who I decided to spar. During our sparring, I realized that my striking was nowhere near well developed. So I started my kickboxing journey, which led me to various places, including training with professional fighters in Sweden and going to Thailand to try out Muay Thai. In this video, I will be taking a look and analyzing how my kickboxing evolved during different sparring sessions I had over the course of the year, from my first sparring with a champion kickboxer to my sparring sessions with my kickboxing teammates later down the road, and eventually my sparring with pro fighters and Muay Thai beasts at the last part of the year of my training, to not only see how my striking improved during this time, but also how I ended up developing some essential flaws that eventually led me to the loss of my second MMA fight. Sparring number 1. My first battle with a kickboxing champion. Before this sparring, I've thought that my striking was decent for a beginner due to my MMA training, and I didn't know what to expect sparring someone of such a high caliber as Sergey. Watching the footage, the first thing that stands out for me is that back then I had no clue whatsoever how striking defense works. I was trying to shell up, but mostly I was just hectically putting my arms up and down, trying to somehow block the punches. I think one of the main reasons for that was because in MMA you fight with small gloves, so during training, defense wasn't emphasized for me as much. But honestly, that's not much of an excuse. I'm also usually the taller person in the sparring, which many times lets me get away with poor defense by keeping distance. But clearly, that did not work out for me while sparring Sergey, who is of similar height and has such advanced skills. I was also turning away from many of the strikes. But how my defense will evolve, we'll still see in the other sparrings. The last main thing that stood out for me in this one was how hectic I was in all of my movements and wasn't able to find my pace. One of the main reasons why I burned myself out so quickly here and had to stop. And it's something I decided to work hard on in the future in order for it not to happen again. Sparring number 2. Sparring a beginner after 6 months of training. Here, I'm sparring someone who joined our kickboxing team a little bit later than me. We are going very light here, unlike what you'll see in the next couple of sparring rounds. But already, I'm seeing progress in my striking. First of all, I'm much more patient and I pace myself better. I wait for opportunities and observe my partner without turning away from his strikes anymore. That is easy to do when you spar a beginner instead of a champion, something you'll see the difference of soon in the next sparrings. But for the moment, sticking to this one, it's clear that my defense slightly evolved, since now I am much more clear on where and why I am holding my hands defensively. After defending a number of strikes, I also constantly look for openings, and once I see an opportunity, I strike at them, which also shows my improvement that happened over the 6 months. But that starts to change once I move on to spar with an advanced practitioner. Sparring number 3. Sparring an advanced person after 6 months of training. Here, I'm sparring my main kickboxing partner, who trained for a similar amount of time to me if we include my MMA experience. Since he's shorter, I'm using my jab a lot to keep him at distance. I also throw a number of kicks to keep him busy and to discourage him from coming in, since I know that that's what he's going for in order to overcome my reach. Nevertheless, he eventually starts to pressure and corner me, where it's visible that I don't feel comfortable, something I later started working on more. I believe this is one of the challenges of being a tall fighter, since you get used to sparring shorter opponents and avoid going into the pocket. But once you eventually get there, that brings trouble, which was kind of one of the reasons for my downfall in my second MMA fight, which we'll still take a look at soon. Still, my pacing and defense here are much better than before, but that is until I sparred with the champ again. Sparring number 4. Sparring a champion after 6 months. Here, I'm sparring Sergey again, and immediately you can see how tense I became once more. I try to relax myself every once in a while, but a fighter of the caliber of Sergey is so good at putting on pressure that it just fries your brain and makes it seem like all of your skills go out of the window. Still, observing the sparring, I see the differences in myself, especially in my ability to pace myself better than before, while not throwing as many unnecessary strikes. Also, I'm observing much better what Sergey will do. Still, once he starts hitting me, I have difficulty keeping my composure. Yet again, something we'll talk about, how it put me into trouble later. But still, progress here is visible, and it continued to be so until my trip to Sweden. Sparring number 5. sparring pro MMA fighter after 9 months of training. Here, I was visiting and sparring with professional Swedish MMA fighter Oliver Enkamp, who has excellent striking skills. During this sparring, we were going very lightly, something I used to be a huge fan of, although recently I slightly changed my relationship to. But I'll get to that a little bit later. What stands out to me in this video is that this is when Oliver showed me the long guard, a stance commonly used in Muay Thai where one arm is extended forward. I quickly fell in love with this stance since it gave me a better way to use my reach advantage, and once I got back home, starting from then, I terrorized all of my smaller opponents with it, and it was evident that it was working since all of them started complaining about it. During this sparring, it's visible that I continue to observe my sparring partner much better, trying to go high and low, once more pacing myself, which in my eyes is a huge improvement from the first sparring. I also use footwork to keep my distance and some head movement to evade Oliver's strikes. Another thing that is visible here is me using my jab even more, but that's a lot because Oliver encouraged me to do it during this round, and I found that it worked really well. The problem that I'm seeing in my sparring though is my tendency to lean back. One more thing I consider to be a problem as a tall fighter. Yet again, since with shorter opponents I can usually get away by doing it, but experienced fighters, such as Oliver, know how to make sure they don't let me do it by cutting the distance and using angles. Sparring number 6. Sparring Muay Thai fighters in Thailand after 1 year of training. In Thailand, my first partner was someone who was clearly still just beginning to spar. It's especially interesting to look at this sparring since here I can almost see myself on the other side of the fence from where I used to be. 5 years ago, I was the new Aikido sensei who was turning and running away from strikes constantly during my first sparring ever. Even in my sparring with Sergey, I was still somewhat afraid of punches, not responding to them properly. Yet here, this time, I am the one putting pressure on someone who had difficulties dealing with my strikes. This way, it's interesting to see how things evolve and change. Yet despite the celebration of my progress, during the next sparring, I now started to see what led me to my downfall in my second MMA fight. In the following sparring, in many ways, a lot of my improvements are still showing up here. I'm observing the situation, looking for openings, pacing myself, and doing my best to counter. Yet in this sparring, I'm also continuing to adopt the long guard, which I brought back from training with Oliver and continue to develop in my home country Lithuania. The problem was that like here and also back home, I was mainly sparring only with smaller partners. Using the long guard with them, I was able to get away with a lot of things, and in my opinion, that way developed a lot of bad habits. While in the past, I used to use my head movement much more, here, my head is pretty much always staying in one place, simply because I'm used to my opponents not reaching it. I continue to use the jab, pace myself, and observe, but once my partner strikes, I usually just lean back. A habit that works only with shorter opponents and only that much. Yet when I got to the cage to fight my second MMA fight, my opponent was taller even than myself, and he also had a great reach. Then, not only was I not used to fighting a taller opponent, I also had many bad habits from sparring mainly shorter partners. During my fight, I am overreaching because I'm not used to my opponent being so far away. I am also not moving my head or feet much, and leaning back as a habit, something that was not helping me out here at all. Looking back at the sparring sessions we examined before, another downfall becomes visible. Most of the time, I was doing light sparring with partners who I was able to handle. Yet once I would experience the pressure of a fighter such as Sergey, a lot of my game went out the window and I wasn't responding as well anymore. Meanwhile, in literature about people who are the best in their respected fields, it was stressed that these people had a tendency to work on the things which they found to be the most difficult for them. For example, a guitar player practicing a song that was way beyond his level. When I was listening to a podcast of Sergey talking to a world champion boxer, they both emphasized how important it is to spar with people who are better than yourself and who you have a difficult time handling. Meanwhile, during my training, I was mostly sparring with people who were either of my level or worse than me. And looking back at my latest cage fight, I think that got in the way for me. Another problem was that I was used not only to sparring smaller opponents, but also sparring them lightly and constantly keeping them at a distance. While I still believe that light sparring is an amazing tool to develop fighting skills, I think for my second fight, I lacked the experience of fighting much better fighters than myself, and I missed having a few more hard sparring rounds. This made me realize that from now on, I will be looking to spar better fighters than myself much more. and not avoid hard sparrings at least once in a while. At the same time, looking at my kickboxing journey, it's still amazing to see the progress, especially how a year ago I was the person turning away, tensing up and eating all the punches, and then a year later, here I was being on the other side of the fence. And of course there will always be mistakes to fix, yet one way or another, it is great to take a look at the journey and to appreciate both the challenges and the progress that it brought. If you want to see my second MMA fight, click on this video right here. Thank you for watching, and as always, I wish you to own your journey.